5, 4, 3, 2.
The Cannibal of London City. London is a city of dichotomies. Its streets, steeped in history and grandeur, are also riddled with shadows that conceal unimaginable horrors. Tonight, we delve into one of its darkest secrets, the story of Thaddeus Kane, a man whose hunger transformed him into something beyond human. This tale is not just about the monster he became, but the lives he destroyed along the way, including one man who dared to stand in his path. If this kind of chilling tale grips your imagination, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for stories from the night. Now, let us begin. The Forbidden Taste. Thaddeus Kane's descent into darkness began in the solemn silence of a Victorian chapel. He was just 10 years old, left to wander the edges of the room while mourners paid their respects to his great uncle. The scent of lilies filled the air, masking the faint metallic tang of death. Candles flickered in their brass holders, casting distorted shadows on the cold stone walls. Thaddeus was a curious child, but his curiosity often led him astray. On this day, it guided him to the open casket. His uncle's lifeless form lay still, the pale skin stretched taut over his hollow cheeks. The boy stared, transfixed. Left alone by his drunken father, Thaddeus reached into his pocket, retrieving a small knife his grandfather had given him. His hand trembled as he opened the blade, a whisper in his mind urging him forward. Before he could stop himself, he made a small incision in the neck of the corpse, peeling back a sliver of flesh. The piece was no bigger than a coin, yet it felt heavy in his hand, as though it carried the weight of an unspeakable act. That night, Thaddeus sat in his bedroom, staring at the piece of flesh. He knew it was wrong, but his thoughts were clouded by an inexplicable compulsion. When he finally placed it on his tongue, he was overwhelmed by the taste, rich, metallic, and strangely satisfying. A warmth spread through his body, filling him with a sensation he could neither name nor escape. Though he vowed never to repeat the act, the memory of that taste lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. A butcher's hunger. Years passed, and Thaddeus Kane buried the memory of that day beneath the monotony of adult life. He became a butcher in Brixton, a solitary man who found solace in the methodical rhythm of his work. By all accounts, he was an ordinary tradesman, his shop a staple of the neighborhood. But shadows lingered in his mind, and the hunger he had buried as a boy began to resurface. One stormy night, Thaddeus stumbled upon the lifeless body of a homeless man slumped in the alley behind his shop. Rain pooled around the corpse, its face pale and eyes glassy. Thaddeus should have called for help, but instead he stood frozen, the scent of flesh filling his nostrils. Something deep inside him stirred, and the compulsion he had once felt as a boy returned with a vengeance. Dragging the body inside, he locked the door and set to work. The sound of the cleaver striking bone echoed in the dimly lit room. To Thaddeus, the act felt strangely natural, as though he were simply preparing another cut of lamb or beef. That night, he cooked and ate a piece of the flesh, savoring the taste he had craved for so long. The warmth returned, stronger this time, coursing through his veins like a drug. The hunger consumed him, and he knew there would be no turning back. Thaddeus began prowling the streets of Brixton at night, choosing his victims carefully. He targeted those who wouldn't be missed, the homeless, the destitute, the invisible. But soon, his appetite grew, and he found himself taking trophies, bones, teeth, and even pieces of flesh to savor later. To hide his crimes, Thaddeus began mixing human meat into the products he sold at his shop. Sausages, pies, and steaks became his instruments of concealment, their flavor earning him a reputation as one of the best butchers in London. Customers flocked to his shop, praising the tenderness of his cuts and the richness of his sausages, unaware of the horrifying truth. Enter Detective Elias Marlowe. Detective Elias Marlowe was a man who had seen it all, or so he thought. A seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and unrelenting resolve, Marlowe had spent years chasing London's worst criminals, but nothing could prepare him for the case of the Butcher of Brixton. When mutilated bodies began appearing in alleyways, Marlowe was assigned to lead the investigation. The press dubbed the killer the Butcher of Brixton, a shadowy figure who left behind little evidence beyond the precision of his cuts. The case was a puzzle, and Marlowe became obsessed with solving it. As he pieced together the pattern of the murders, Marlowe's personal life began to suffer. His wife, Eleanor, begged him to step back, to prioritize their family over his work, but Marlowe couldn't let go. The case consumed him, and the distance between him and Eleanor grew. Unbeknownst to Marlowe, Thaddeus Kane had been watching him. The butcher saw Marlowe as a threat, an enemy who needed to be dealt with, and Thaddeus had a way of dealing with his enemies. One fateful evening, Eleanor Marlowe disappeared. Her car was found abandoned near Brixton, the keys still in the ignition. Marlowe's heart sank as he searched for her, following every lead and questioning every suspect. Days passed with no sign of her, and the fear that gnawed at him grew into despair. Then a package arrived at his office, a blood-stained piece of fabric that belonged to Eleanor, along with a note scrawled in red ink. "Stay out of my way, or she won't be the last." The message was clear. Thaddeus Kane had taken Eleanor as punishment for Marlowe's pursuit. The revelation shattered the detective, but it also fueled his determination. Catching the butcher was no longer just a case, it was a personal vendetta. Marlowe's investigation reached a breaking point as he closed in on Thaddeus Kane. The evidence pointed to the butcher's shop, but Marlowe needed proof. Disguised as a customer, he entered the shop, noting the cold, calculating demeanor of the man behind the counter. That night, Marlowe returned with a warrant. The basement of the shop was a scene of horror beyond imagination. Slabs of human flesh hung from hooks, their edges marked with the precise cuts of a skilled butcher. Jars of preserved organs lined the shelves, and blood stained every surface. But among the carnage, Marlowe found something that froze him in place. A torn piece of Eleanor's dress, hanging limply from a hook. Thaddeus Kane was waiting for him. The butcher stepped out of the shadows, cleaver in hand, his face calm and expressionless. "You shouldn't have come here, Detective," Thaddeus said, his voice eerily steady. Marlowe drew his gun, but Thaddeus moved quickly, knocking it to the ground. The two men clashed in the blood-soaked basement, their fight brutal and unrelenting. Thaddeus fought with the precision of a man used to wielding knives, while Marlowe fought with the desperation of a man who had lost everything. The struggle ended when Marlowe, in a final act of defiance, overturned a lantern, setting the room ablaze. Flames consumed the grotesque lair, their light casting shadows of the two men locked in combat. Thaddeus screamed as the fire engulfed him, his monstrous form collapsing into the inferno. Days later, as Marlowe tried to piece his life back together, forensic evidence from the fire revealed a horrifying truth. Among the remains recovered from the butcher's shop was a bone fragment bearing distinctive teeth marks. It was Eleanor's. Thaddeus Kane hadn't just killed her, he had eaten her. The revelation shattered Marlowe, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. The Butcher of Brixton was gone, but the damage he had wrought would never be undone. Though Thaddeus Kane was dead, whispers of his legacy lingered in the shadows of London. Some say the hunger never truly died, that it simply waits, lurking in the darkness for someone else to succumb. London is a city of stories, but some are too horrifying to forget. If this tale of tragedy and monstrous human nature gripped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Stay tuned for more tales from Stories from the Night. Until next time, stay safe and beware the shadows.